Welcome back to the Civic Brief. I'm Dr. Ike Wilson. Now, in this episode actually being our ninth experience, again, experience is 3 to 4 episodes organized around a meta theme. For this, our experience number 9, the first episode, our guest fireside conversation, we're going to focus on a conversation around a heady issue and one that we're living with today. Just look around at maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandeb and many other places and spaces. And you'll understand, we will all understand the heart of the question that we're going to grapple with today. This theme, what I'll call the hardest part of war, and let me just go ahead with the subtitle at this point, why military power of any kind, is necessary, certainly so, but never sufficient. Now, for more than a century, Americans and frankly, strategists everywhere have searched for a decisive form of military power. When we talk about decisive forms of power, we're really talking about use of force, instruments of force. Okay. At different moments, we believe the answer was clear. Decisive land battle, sea control, strategic bombing, nuclear deterrence. Today, we look for that decisive win through things like cyber, space, in all sorts of precision strike. Of particular note today, autonomous vehicles, drones. Now, each generation in its own way, well, they ask the same question. Is this finally the form of power that can win wars on its own, that instrument of force, that decisive instrument of force? Well, if we pay attention and listen and learn, history gives us a consistent answer to that question. No. Not because military power doesn't matter, it certainly does. It matters enormously, but because war is not ultimately decided by instruments of power alone. War is decided by political outcomes. And the hardest part of war begins when the shooting appears to be ending. Now, today we're going to explore that idea with two extraordinary practitioners and thinkers. The Honorable Dr. Mike Vickers is one of the most consequential strategists of the modern era, serving as a senior defense official, intelligence leader, and architect of U.S. covert and special operations campaigns. His work during the Soviet Afghanistan war helped reshape the strategic balance of that conflict, and his career has spanned intelligence, irregular warfare, and grand strategy at the highest levels. He is also the author of, by all means available, a memoir of a life in intelligence, special operations, and strategy. General Dave Deptula is one of the leading thinkers and practitioners of modern air power. He played a central role in designing and executing the air campaign in Operation Desert Storm and has spent decades shaping how we think about aerospace power, operational art, and the integration of advanced military capabilities. He now serves as Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. So then I ask again, why military power, or state again, the provocation? Why military power, air power, land power, naval power, or folks, any sort and kind of power is necessary, but never sufficient? That is our provocation today, the topic of our discussion, and our conversation is next. Join us on the Civic Brief.
Welcome to the Civic Brief with Dr. Isaiah Ike Wilson III, where complex issues meet everyday lives. Now, let's begin.
Well, folks, welcome back to the Civic Brief. And as promised, two great Americans perfectly selected for this conversation we're having today. I want to remind us the title of this conversation is The Hardest Part of War, and really grappling with an evergreen question, a puzzle, a paradox of why any use of force, any instrument of power, particularly military power, we have great expectations in those uses of force and power, but they oftentimes prove, while necessary, largely insufficient. Again, I've given you full bios of our guests today. Let me just quickly welcome and then turn the microphone over to them to allow them to make their own opening comments, maybe even contesting with some of the framing I did in our preamble. But I want to welcome the Honorable Dr. Mike Vickers and the equally honorable Lieutenant General Retired Dave Deptula. Great to have you both, gentlemen. I can't tell you how long I've been looking forward to this conversation. I want to turn it over to you. Perhaps, Mike, you want to open us up in any opening comments or contestations, fence with the foil I've put on the table, and then we'll jump right back into it. Turn over to Dave, do the same, and we'll jump right back into the conversation.
No, it's great to be with you, Ike. I look forward to the discussion. No opening comments other than to say it's great to see my longtime friend, General Deptula.
Outstanding. General?
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Ike. I am looking forward to the discussion, and likewise, I always and still do hold Dr. Vickers in the highest esteem, and great to see you, Mike, and look forward for the chat to come.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Okay, well, gentlemen, let's jump right into it. Again, I always over prepare. And people who know me, including my viewers and listeners, know that I am cursed with the gift of gab. So I want to be very efficient with our time today, but we've got a lot of ground to cover, more than we're going to have time to. We'll see how much we can get into this. And we really just want to have a running conversation. Again, the idea of the Civic Brief is to, as I say in the marketing, where complex issues meet everyday lives. You try to, help inform an already informed general public, a laity, on the heady, oftentimes heavily jargonized issues of war and peace, foreign and domestic politics and policy. The intersection doesn't come between those don't come any more poignantly than on matters of war and peace, warfare and peacefare, and the use of instruments of force for power purposes, and particularly important for the citizenry of a constitutional small l, small d, small r, liberal democratic republic, right? We need an informed public to frankly keep folks like us, the managers of violence and the nation's instruments of the same, on political object purpose, on path, on glide slope. Had to sneak that in as an aviator, an Army aviator myself, once upon a time when I was a soldier and an aviator once and young. All right, I'm going to open us up with a broad, I think what's probably going to be the anchoring question for our whole conversation today, and let you both parlay with it a bit, and then we'll go from there and take us right into the rubber meets the road. Let me start with this. Now, for over a century at least, right, we've debated whether any single form of military power, and you'll typically see me put power in suspicion quotes, because when I say military power, and I think when a lot of people say military power, we're really talking about force, instruments of force, right? And if we think about Newton's power equation, we immediately see power on one side of the equal sign and force among other variables on the other, which tells us that while mutually reinforcing, they're two different things. But I sometimes think that we conflate the two, and I think that's going to be at the heart of our conversation. But we've debated over a century now whether any single form of military force, air power, sea power, land power, etc., can decisively win wars. But stepping back from that a bit, we're going to get into all that. Here's the anchor. Why do we keep searching for a decisive form of military power when war is, at its core, a political process? And how about General Deptula? You want to start us off, and then we'll switch over to Mike.
Yeah, sure, Ike. I think that people search for a decisive form of military power because they want war to be cleaner, faster, and more controllable than it actually is.
Yeah.
If you listen to the dialogue that occurs, in the media every day, many pundits and even military personnel tend to focus on the instruments of war in the various domains, air, land, sea, space, cyber, whatever. because those are the tools that we organize, train, and equip around. But as you mentioned, war's ultimately not about the instrument.
Right.
It's about compelling a political outcome.
Right.
So, air power, sea power, land power, whatever, they can each create strategic effects.
Hmm.
They can destroy capability, impose cost, paralyze decision makers, and alter an adversary's expectations, but none of them by themselves can substitute for a coherent political objective.
Right.
So the real issue is not whether one form of military power can win, whatever that might be defined, in isolation. The issue is whether military action is connected to a political strategy that defines what winning actually means.
Yes.
So I think, maybe that's not a nutshell, but that's sort of a summation of the way I view the challenge.
I think it's one heck of a nutshell, and you already have the haunts of that dead old Prussian Karl von Clausewitz ringing in my ears, and I'll reserve my comments on that. But I want to turn it over to Dr. Vickers. Mike, any thoughts? I'm sure you
Yeah,
do.
no, I agree with Dave completely. I mean, yes, the question about military power is an end in itself, and of course,
Right.
Clausewitz tells us, it's got to be connected to your political aim and how you achieve that aim, and that
Right.
means a theory of victory. You can win all kinds of ways, you can lose all kinds of ways, but you got to, make sure your means are connected to your ends, and they'll produce your ends.
Exactly. The haunt of the Clausewitzian haunt that hits me when you both have shared what you just shared is that I think it was what he called the supreme judgment, a caution and warning of do not separate. I'll paraphrase. I won't get him exactly right here, but close to it. Do not beware and do not find yourself divorcing what he called the military object, the instrument, from the political object, the purpose of the war, the ends. For when you do so, you're liable to create something that is, quote, pointless and devoid of all sense.
Right.
And I've always been haunted by that last piece, pointless and devoid of all sense, because it seems to me, well, that's bad, but it's also kind of even Steven. I mean, it's almost, well, I'll be left no worse for wear. I won't be gaining anything, right? I think he meant a lot worse than pointless and
Yeah.
devoid of all sense. I think we're talking about something that's really almost, I'll use this word, almost a grotesque
Yeah.
extension. Yeah, any thoughts on that weird
I think
interpretation of
senseless
Clausewitz?
violence is pretty bad. I mean, I think
Yeah,
he's
right.
intending to be critical, and it's part of he echoes Archidamus from the Peloponnesian War, the king of the Spartans, that
Exactly.
before you embark on a war, you got to understand what it is you're trying to do. What is your war?
Right, right. This notion of endless wars, forever wars, seem to be haunted by this as well. Dave, your point in regard to that, of your opening point of, you know, and maybe this is particular to um, regimes that are democracies, small d democracies, nation states, democratic nation states, that we place so much hope and expectation in military instrumentation, being able to provide us a win, and a relative peace as you can come to know it, to go back to Clausewitz, because we have such an abhorrence for war and warfare, and because we want to make our wars, if and once we have to go into them anyway, at as short and as antiseptic as possible. I have another idea, and I'll put it on the table, and maybe you parlay on that, but we're certainly going to get into it as we go forward here, and I'll transition us here in a second. But I wonder how much, the fact that our U.S. military, the wider West, really, in more general terms, but specifically the American military, all of our services, we're so exquisitely elite at the prosecution of our instrumentation. as individual and separate instruments of force for power purposes in undominable when we joint and combine put those instruments together in force packages that we maybe there's a bit of an old Tommy Franks catastrophic success phenomenon there that we've kind of unintendedly baked into the psyche of our general public and their duly elected representatives. That great expectation of getting magical things from military instrumentation because we're just so darn good at the conduct of tactics, grand tactics, major combat operations, to an again, I'll use that word, exquisite, a unique and peculiar exquisite level. And any thoughts on that?
I'll just jump in there and say, and I don't know how the public could carry away that message that I understand you articulated, but after 20 frapping years of force application in Afghanistan, you would think that they would have learned that lesson. That it isn't, depending upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish,
Yeah.
it isn't going to be that clean, that easy. But part of that goes back to what we already talked about, and that is the clear definition of what are the political objectives, what are the critical U.S. national security interests that we're trying to achieve, and defining those up front. I would, forgive me for going on a bit, but
No, I want you to go on a bit on this.
Well,
Absolutely.
if you go on, if you look back at the conflict war in Afghanistan, I would suggest to you that we actually achieved our critical U.S. national security interest by the 31st of December 2001.
100%.
We'd removed the Taliban from governance. Okay, there was a government instilled in place that was friendly to the United States and the coalitions, and we eliminated the Al Qaeda terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. Okay, they moved into Pakistan, but in terms of Afghanistan, we'd remove them.
Yeah.
Okay, see you later. Have a nice life. If you do it again, we'll come back, but we're out of here. But we did that so quick with the combination of the introduction of air power with special operations forces.
Absolutely.
And other government agencies in that 2.5-month time frame, that the traditional military conception of moving decisive forces into place, Tommy Franks hadn't even finished doing the tip-fid planning for moving the hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground into Afghanistan yet. So there was not the realization that we'd already accomplished our objectives. And then when they got there, we saw the biggest example of mission creep in history. Because people got there, they looked around and said, well, hey, Taliban's gone. We got a friendly government in place. Taliban's out of here. I know. Let's build some wells and build some schools and try to correct the underlying basis of terrorism. That's unobtainium. Plus, that's not a military achievable objective. So we kind of got off the rails there, and then we spent 20 years, 1 year at a time, trying to figure out how to accomplish this unattainable set of objectives when in reality we'd already accomplished our critical U.S. national security objectives. So it all goes back to what we started this with, and that is clearly defining, what is the desired end state, and, working backwards from there to how to achieve it. And it's not simply about the employment of force or forces. It is the combination of all the elements of national security, as well as incorporating our partners and allies' perspectives as well.
What I love about this, what I love about planning in general, an old military planner, what I love about it is you plan like this show, you come up with a run of show. I mean, gentlemen, we've been laying out question sets and ideas that we wanted to talk about. And then you get into the rubber meets the road and no plan survives first contact. And I count on it. I love it. I'm almost obsessed with that. Generally, you've taken us into exactly the places we need to go. I'm so glad we're talking about Afghanistan. You've put two things on the table at least. You've spoken to a paradox between the American public, and you said it this way. How could the public continue to believe in the success of the military instrumentation when we haven't achieved the political outcome? You said it better than I just said it. There's a paradox there that we've got to unpack, because it seems like we are kind of primed to measure necessary but insufficient things in terms of what the things are that you should measure and determine a winning trajectory and a winning outcome when it comes to war. The other piece you put is, I 100% agree. Not, it doesn't matter a lick that I agree at all, but I'm with you. My granddad was an old Baptist minister, so you'll probably get some hallelujahs and amens out of me as well. I'm very animated. I think it's in our genes. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's what you marked, the marker you put, month almost to date, of a limited war, a balanced war of limited ends, limited ways, and limited means. A balanced war strategy, war policy. I'm counting you all to remind me. I think that war policy was pretty much declared, that our original entry going in, and one of the reasons why we ended up initially calling Afghanistan the good war, because it kind of married with the civic culture of the United States of a right and righteous war because of a defensive engagement, in a broad sense of the defensive, because we were attacked and we pinpointed where the attack came from that safe haven and sanctuary. The Bush doctrine got it, I think, right there. That's not a polemic or an ideological or partisan political statement. I just think that's just good, right policy initially. Limited war, but then we mission creep ourselves through the win. It's almost as if we didn't see the success tape, and we just kept running when the race, our declared part of the race, was over as we had defined it initially, and the forces that we allocated troop to task for the mission. I've counted in my own research over 21 years of the Afghanistan war, at least 4 other moments where, in the redeclared, at least by behavior, if not by formal policy, we ran equally through those by action declared strategic objectives as well. I mean, I think we had reached success criteria based on political strategic outcomes and objectives at least 4 to 5 times. But you hit the one, you nailed it, in my not so humble opinion, on the first run through the tape, and catastrophic success. Go ahead, Mike, please.
I would beg to differ just a bit.
Okay,
I
good.
agree with everything Dave said about the spectacular campaign in '01 and the need to limit our objectives, to basically denying Al Qaeda and its Taliban hosts any sanctuary, so we can't have another 9/11 attack, but also to prevent their reconstitution.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the big dangers in grand strategy is strategic overreach or underreach.
Right.
When you do nothing and you let threats gather, you tend to get a worse world out of that.
Yep.
But also, when you throw the kitchen sink at something that doesn't merit the kitchen sink, you're going to run into trouble, particularly in a democratic polity.
Yeah.
And so, as Dave very accurately said, when you have all this mission creep and you're going to try to create, you think to achieve your counterterrorism ends in Afghanistan and in the region, you have to create a Central Asian Valhalla. You're headed for trouble. And particularly when you're spending so much money and so many troops and treasure to do it, and you still can't win, right? Why? Because the Pakistanis got a sanctuary. The other thing is, you're not going to build a Central Asian Valhalla. And so people are going to look at it and say, hey, you're not doing so well on this metric of glorious nation building.
Yeah.
And, as Dave said, that's not a real military task. And so then what we did, I mean, 2 of the phrases that I hate from politicians is there's no military solution, because while, again, it has to serve political ends, the military power can contribute to those ends often.
Yes.
And then also this notion of forever war. Well, no one
Yeah.
wants to choose a forever war, but what do you do when you're in one, right? And so you've got to you've got to make sure you can outlast the enemy, right? And so,
Right.
what do we do at the end of Afghanistan? Okay, we made a lot of mistakes. We spent too much. We have two presidents of the United States that preferred defeat to a stalemate where we hold all the cards. That's not winning. You know,
Yeah.
that is really, so again, if your long-term strategic goal is to prevent Afghanistan being used again, you want to do it with economy of force because you got
Right.
other interests and everything else. But you sure don't want to leave a vacuum there and have your enemy defeat you after 20 years, or you self-defeat yourself.
Yes.
And then to further on Dave's point about the power of air power and indigenous force, and a lot of those guys were my Mujahideen commanders in the
Exactly.
1980s. But we followed Al Qaeda around the world to non-war zones, to Pakistan border region, to Yemen and elsewhere, and largely with air power and a global counterterrorism network, we disrupted, dismantled, and took that organization apart with
Right.
precision air power provided by drones and intelligence, different kind, but still worked really well. And
Yeah.
so, again, to underscore what Dave said, we largely achieved our operational aims over a couple decades. We just blew it at the end.
So why are we making this error over and over again? What's behind it?
That's easy. That's easy. Now, you're not going to like my answer. Well, maybe you will,
But
but I
that's
mean,
okay. That's okay. I like easy answers.
it's because we conduct a regime change every 4 years.
There it is.
Okay, so look, it's a complex answer. It really is. So I'm going to reverse myself. I said it's easy, but it's really complex. But part of the answer is we change our regime every 4 years.
Yeah.
And then that kind of speaks to the political aspect. If you look at the military aspect, and this is another one that's really difficult, yet we have this magnificent professional military education system, right? Except what do? We rotate people in and out of positions
Yeah.
in a really relatively, except for the senior most positions, below service chiefs, and maybe co-coms, people move every 18 to 24 months.
Yes.
So there is I go back to I know that all these different organizations that are supposedly labeled lessons learned organizations, they're, pardon my cynicism, but I've gotten to that point in my life where we don't learn a lot of lessons. We observe
Right.
them, we record them, then we
Right.
move on and we learn something new.
Yeah. I call them lessons gathered, not yet learned. I mean, to me,
Yeah.
a lesson's not really learned until you get it into the dot mil PF, until you inculcate it into doctrine, organizational, operational approaches, et cetera, et
Yep.
cetera.
But even then, Ike,
And then,
even then, depending upon, and look, all of this is dependent upon individuals, depending on who is thrust into
yeah.
the cudgel of combat at the time,
Hmm.
maybe they didn't read that
Mm.
Right.
particular set of documents.
Right.
And so now they're going to invent something all on their own. I'll tell you a real quick story.
Please.
In the aftermath of Desert Storm, the historians came over and they're asking me to walk through their stuff and explain what went on and what was the basis of the planning. And they said, well, what you guys did has nothing to do. It's not in, DOD manual 3.7.2-3, whatever. I'm going, what? I go, we didn't have time to read any of that stuff. This is the
Right.
way we organize ourselves, and this is the way we did business because these were the constraints that we were faced with, and this is what
Yeah.
we came up with. So look, it's not an excuse. It's a reality of the way we do planning and execution. Yes, those documents provide underlying fundamental education, and one would hope that over time, that's how we educate our leadership, but it doesn't always stick. And then we don't necessarily learn, but before we have to move on to something else.
You haunt me, General, with, from a PME standpoint, a professional military education standpoint, with the all too often stated credo of, and I'll quote, it's only a lot of reading if you do it.
Yeah.
And
Well,
to your point, do we, it depends. It's all there. It's not even all there, right? But a lot of it's there in written doctrinal form. But even then, if it's, you still got to read it, you still got to study, you still got to put it in historical and political context and understand what you're reading historically in that particular context. And then delicately, in a most similar but not same case way, draw lessons that are rightly transposable to your contemporary and future moment. That's a lot of work, and it's very that you can get lost in translation at every one of those little mile markers that I just laid out.
yeah,
The,
let me just jump
yeah,
in here
please.
because I
Yeah,
was a bit, I was a bit maybe harsh on the PME process, but no, what I really want to do is reinforce it for the reasons that you just made.
yeah,
I mean, it's extraordinarily important to have that, take the fundamental time to get exposed to those lessons,
right.
to be able to internalize them, because then whoever gets thrust into the cudgel of combat
Yeah.
has that basis upon which to, and they're going to do it anyway.
Mhm.
We're all products of our experience and understanding
That's right.
and applicability. So
Well, we're
it's
not robots.
extraordinarily
We're not
important.
robots. We're counting on agility.
Yeah.
We're counting on innovation and creativity, right?
Yeah, and
We're
I
counting
and
on.
I would say too, often a lot of our great successes are where you have someone steeped in military operational art, but then they adapt to local
There
circumstances.
you go.
Dave did it in Desert Storm,
Yes.
Afghanistan in the 80s. When I was trained in special forces, it was to, lead a guerrilla regiment of 1,500 behind Soviet lines.
Right.
Then I had an insurgent army of 150,000, so we had to kind of make it up.
Right.
Same thing with, you know, doctrine would tell you Afghanistan in '01 would fail, and it succeeded spectacularly. Not a big enough ground force and not, everything else. Same thing with our counterterrorism campaign.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you the number of times I heard that our remotely piloted aircraft weren't doing anything and everything else. And then I'd say at the end, okay, where are these Al Qaeda guys? There aren't too many left.
Exactly. You're reminding me of my experience with the counter ISIL campaign in Raqqa, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
similar. I mean, again, different verse, similar, all too similar, if not same as the first. There's a dark paradoxical repeat here. You both have mentioned the two historical cases that I think matter most because they're innovation moments. I mean, dare I use the old language and call it they're moments of not just evolution in military political affairs, but revolutions in military political affairs. General Gulf War One and the elite joint combined use and utility of joint combined uses of instruments of power. But I want to pinpoint, I want to focus on air power, right? And I'm going to ask you this question, and I'm going to pose the same thing to you, Dr. Vickers, Mike. From an air power standpoint, what did we get right from that exquisite rightness of how we employed air air forces as part of an air power, as part of that, combined joint and combined force. And similarly to you, Mike, going back to the Afghan Soviet war and the U.S. Indirect approach, our indirect method, and please expound on both of these gentlemen to the full extent because we want our readers and our viewers to get a better understanding of these two historical moments because they're very contemporarily relevant because they give birth to different capabilities and capacities for employment, use and utility of force that represents and reflects an American way. Particularly with the marriage of special operations forces with precision guided munitions in support of an indigenous ground force. I would argue you have elements of that even in the Gulf War. It's just to grand scale and in a traditional mechanized way. But there are harmonies between those two models of support to a mujahideen force in Afghanistan and force on force mechanized warfare in the Gulf War One. I'd love for you to both talk, and here's the question to you both. What lessons did we gather from those two experiences of use and utility of those instruments of force? And what did we get right and what have we gotten wrong? Because I think I think there's probably a story in both in terms of what we've not gotten quite right in terms of those exemplars.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I'm gonna jump in here because it's a wonderful opportunity to address something that I think too few people have retained because unfortunately time moves on. And I'm going to use the example of Desert Storm
Yeah.
because I think it's one of the most applicable demonstrations of the true meaning of jointness, if you will, that we've seen.
And maybe a quick explanation of jointness.
Yeah, jointness is using the right force at the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of, let's go back to Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. As a result of some of the failures of the application of military force up until that time, which began in Desert One in Iran, of all places, the failed attempt to rescue the Americans who were held hostage by the Iranians in 1979, because the individual services had tried, they were trained and they were employed as services, not as a joint or integrated set of forces to accomplish military objectives. That Goldwater-Nichols Act put in place this notion of joint operations, where combatant commanders, not the services, would be the ones who would employ force.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the fundamental, still to this day, misunderstandings is that the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Space Force, Coast Guard, they don't fight. They provide components to a combatant commander who establishes a particular joint task force that is tailor-made to meet the needs of the particular contingency.
Right.
Jointness is not little league rules. It's not everybody gets to play. It's not every service component comes into the fight in equal component amounts in fights. It's tailor-made. That's the beauty of a joint force approach.
Yeah.
Which goes back to the point that it's not an issue when you start talking about the individual services. There's not one service that's better or can do greater things than the other services. We need them all.
Right.
We need to have the strongest Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force in the world if we want to maintain our position as the world's sole superpower, which is slowly going away, but that's another discussion. Mm-hmm. My point is, and now with that kind of fundamental description, let's go back to Desert Storm. In Desert Storm, you had Army four-star General Norman Schwarzkopf, who I think, quite frankly, and I've been involved in a lot of joint operations, probably the best example of a joint force commander to date. Because what he did was he understood the decisive advantage of using air operations and air power for the majority of this operation to paralyze, isolate, incapacitate, and destroy, render ineffective Saddam Hussein's deployed military forces, mainly consisting of army forces, for 90% of the operation. And then when they were down to a point that he had determined 50% level of effectiveness, where traditionally ground forces, if they're reduced by 15 to 20%, are considered non-effective, but he pushed it down to 50, and you can argue whether it was 50 or 55 or 60 or 45, whatever, significantly reduced. Then he introduced surface forces to necessarily reoccupy Kuwait and shove the remaining Iraqis out of there. So I go back to, it was in an appropriate use of right force, right place, right time to accomplish what is arguably one of the most effective military campaigns in modern history. And so I think that the lessons learned are jointness is right force, right place, right time. Let's not just try to equivocate it to Little League rules.
Right.
And I think that was one of the principal lessons that come out of Desert Storm that, quite frankly, I'm afraid that we don't teach anymore in our professional military education courses. And that's not hypothetical, supposition. I go down and teach at a variety of different institutions, and I hear it all the time.
Yes.
Well, General, you just gave us a description of what went on in Desert Storm, but that's not the way we fight anymore. We fight jointly. I just told you what jointness is, so then I have to go through the lecture about it's not equal numbers of components from each one of the services, and they're not aware of that.
But to that point, my sense, and your sense is better than mine on this. You were there. My sense is that the takeaway from the Gulf War, one, like, contemporarily, is that it was a war waged and won by air power almost alone.
No, I don't. I really hesitate, and this is kind of gets into what started. Where we really kind of started is people making claims that wars can be won by force
Right.
application in
Legal
one
instrument.
medium or another.
Right.
No, they're not. Just because one force may have resulted in Desert Storm, yeah, okay. Look, for the first time, I think in history, air power was used as the key force.
Yes.
I would agree to that, or the centerpiece of operations, but it wasn't the only force. That's why I go back to right force, right place, right time.
Right.
Land forces were critical in that operation. It just so happened that they weren't the centerpiece, or they were not the preponderance of force.
Right.
And this goes back to the definition of jointness. Every contingency is going to be different. That's the beauty of this joint approach.
Yes.
But there are a lot of people out there that like to perpetuate the myth that,
That's what I'm trying to get at, this part.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
they try to perpetuate the myth that, the only way you can accomplish your objectives is by, defeating your adversary with boots on the ground and stepping on his neck with a bayonet in his face. Well, no, that's just as absurd as saying that, that air power can win wars alone. That's not the issue. What, and why this debate persists is flabbergasting to me, because they often distort a central air power argument. They turn it
Yes.
into an air power alone.
Yes.
When serious air power thinkers have never argued that war occurs in isolation from politics, intelligence, other services, whatever.
Yes.
The real argument's different. It's that air power can create strategic effects directly, and it does not always have to be treated as subordinate supporting arm to a land campaign.
Right.
So, the claim that wars can only be won by conquering and occupying ground has become one of the most durable cliches in American defense commentary. And it's repeated so often that many treat it as settled truth, and it's not. It's in fact categorically false.
Which
So-
may contribute to what Mike had raised before with Afghanistan about running through the success tape, because we've allowed our understanding of what constitutes a finish as nothing less than nation building or state building. With that, I don't want to put that, those are my words. I don't want to put them in your mouth, Mike, but it seemed that that's where sort of where you had brought us with the Afghanistan case. But I'd kind of like you to do what Dave just did with the Soviet Afghanistan war.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what Dave said. There's, you know, ground forces have their important role as part of the joint force, but how you apply it and what the ground force is and how much of it really varies.
Yeah.
And so cases, for instance, World War II, we had to win the Battle of the Atlantic so we could move forces to Europe. We had to weaken Germany significantly, their capacity with strategic bombing. We had to win the air war before D-Day and then support ground forces. And we had the Soviets on the other. All that was necessary.
Yeah.
But when we've had large ground forces in places for a long time, particularly irregular warfares, we haven't done well. And, part of that is our politics and others, but you certainly have to take that on board and looking at, all forms of conflict. So to the Afghan resistance case. So my job one, when I was blessed to become the Afghan Covert Action Program officer in CIA, our budget had just been quadrupled, was to really shift the air balance. The
Right.
Soviets had a huge advantage in air power um, uh, that they exploited to terrorize the resistance, and particularly the Hind attack helicopter. And so we pursued a multi-pronged approach. We gave the resistance a lot of surface-to-air missiles, first Soviet or Chinese copies. They'd gone from, in the course of like a year, from 20 systems to like 2,000. And
Right.
then we introduced some Western systems, the British blowpipe, finally the American Stinger. And then we increased the number of our anti-aircraft guns, mainly for defensive purposes. When the Soviets and their Afghan allies would attack resistance positions with helicopters, they would face heavy machine guns shooting them at the end. We gave the resistance a lot of rockets so that they could shell air bases and kill aircraft on the ground, and then demolitions and sabotage with their intelligence networks where they could blow up Soviet fighter bombers. One of the happiest moments of my time there was when we blew up 21 MiG fighter bombers at the Shindan Air Base, and all you could see afterwards was the burn marks on the runway. It was
Right.
done with demolitions. So it was
Yeah.
an unconventional air campaign, but it didn't win air supremacy for us, but it contested the air. It made the
Yeah.
Soviets fly higher, caused them a lot of losses. But we also then really built up at the same time the resistance forces to do combined arms operations, to do much larger ambushes, increase their ammunition so they can fight more. Sustainment is really important.
Right.
And we and the Soviets escalated at the same time. They did a surge like we did in Iraq with General Petraeus. We essentially increased our support for the Afghan resistance by a factor of 12 in 12 months.
Yeah.
And we won that battle of escalation. After that 12-month period, Gorbachev started the path to pull out. So air, was really anti-air, but air used offensively and
Yeah.
defensively was very important to strengthening the Afghan resistance. And I would say, too, our campaigns against Al Qaeda after Al Qaeda left Afghanistan were predominantly air. We used indigenous forces in various
Right.
parts of the world and also intelligence agencies to disrupt. But the thing that really dismantled Al Qaeda was precision air power.
What I mean, in preambling, Mike, I talked about, the Charlie Wilson's War book and film articulation of what you've just described from having been there and done that. And that haunting end statement, paraphrasing, we did all these great things, these things really happen, and then we effed up the end game. Is that right? Is that right? Because I'm juxtaposing that with what you said a little bit earlier about,
Well,
we
So,
we won, in Afghanistan, our war in Afghanistan, to Dave's point, we had achieved our limited
yeah,
aims. And then I think, Dave, you said what we could have done at that point is U.S. war policy over. Does that mean that the war by its nature over? No. But our war policy over. Does that mean we'll never go back again? No. It might mean there's another war policy that brings you back on your vital interests as a nation,
yeah,
a community of nations. So I'm juxtaposing those two things against, the Charlie Wilson's War articulation of, we
yeah.
screwed up the end game, and the end game implied there that it's something more, it's something expansive into nothing less than a state or nation building.
Yeah. So
You're
there's
right.
right. So there's a cautionary tale in all three cases, and
Thank you.
let me
Yeah.
let me talk about it. So,
Great.
after this unimaginable success of driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan, the
Yeah.
only war that the Red Army had lost in its history,
Hmm.
um, that 1989 when the last soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge into
Right.
Soviet Uzbekistan at the time, was the year that the Berlin Wall fell and Eastern Europe started coming apart. Solidarity, an opposition government was elected in Poland. So U.S. attention turned naturally, as you'd expect, in the Cold War began in Europe, to the reunification of Germany and the liberation of Eastern Europe. And, Afghanistan was kind of chalked up as this victory.
Yeah.
And then to complicate things, there was a congressional amendment that was kind of a ticking time bomb called the Pressler Amendment as we were conducting
Oh,
this
yeah.
covert war.
Yeah.
But it said if the president of the United States couldn't certify that Pakistan wasn't had crossed certain thresholds to developing nuclear weapons, then we would have to cut off all aid, which we did in 1990.
Right.
So we essentially completely exited the region, and within a couple years, Afghanistan turned into a civil war. And after the brutal civil war, Pakistan backed the Taliban. Taliban took over, invited in Al Qaeda, and there's a path to 9/11.
Yes.
The problem with that tale, so Bob Gates and I, think big mistake to disengage completely. You don't have to, there's no resistance to support. You just got to make sure your interests are protected. And we failed to do that as a country. The counter I would add to that, though, is that over 12 years, a series of administrations saw this developed. And after our embassies were blown up in East Africa,
Right.
we did this kind of feckless cruise missile strike in
Right.
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
When, if we really knew 9/11 was coming and our policy would be to deny sanctuary and hunt these guys wherever they were, we probably should have done, if we could play the movie over, we would do something different between 1998 and 9/11.
But we
Same thing with the
didn't we kind of,
counterterrorism.
but didn't we
Go ahead.
I'm gonna, sorry, just real quick inject and then go back. I'll give the mic back to you. Didn't we kind of rinse repeat, arguably in Iraq 2011 to 14 in some respect?
Yes, yes. So, after the success of the counterinsurgency campaign, in Iraq, in a way, is easier than Afghanistan
Hugely.
uh, for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
But then disengaging and treating it as a normal country
Right.
caused ISIS to all the politics that were bad
Right.
about Iraq, about sectarian politics, never went away. Right.
Right.
So the Shiites started really messing with the Sunni and other things. You got ISIS out of that. Syrian civil war gave ISIS a big sanctuary. And by 14, they're on the gates of Baghdad,
Yes.
coming from Syria.
Yeah.
Never should have happened. But, it's one of the cases where, we declared victory too soon. And so, the challenges that we face with our successful campaigns, as I said, is one, we eventually got tired of Afghanistan and traded stalemate for defeat. And then, even in our successful campaigns against Al Qaeda, doesn't mean they can't come back. You haven't eliminated all the root causes, and we're not going to do that through development programs. We have to be realistic about that, but you also have to mind your interests. And that's generally with small forward presence of intelligence officers and some air power that you can do that.
Dave, any thoughts there? I have so many running through my head right now, and we're well into the script now. Just to give you a sense of where we are, again, I promise to be generous, economical with your time. I'd like to go maybe another 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 max.
No, I fully subscribe to Mike's description. I mean, I've got nothing to add to what he said. I think that some of the points that he's made are just spot on. That unfortunately people don't recognize that. Yeah, Mike, how did you say it again? I want to capture that in terms of, we traded stalemate where we had a decisive advantage, if you want. Well, maybe decisive is the wrong word. Where we had an
Big
advantage
advantage.
Yes.
Yeah.
for surrender.
Right.
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 I mean,
we had a
really,
friendly government. We had a friendly government that could help us as a force multiplier, and we could use the territory to monitor it with air power and advisors. And
Yeah,
right.
and what did we? And we traded that away
Yeah.
for a headline because we
Right.
wanted to leave before 20 years was over. Are
Right.
you kidding me? But
Terrible.
that's what
Yeah.
drove that unstrategic decision.
Right. And so if you look at, for instance, Colombia, where we've had kind of a modest success, one,
Right.
it took 45 years.
Yes.
Two, it was mostly done through indirect assistance and advisors, but we stayed the course. And
Right.
when they went through their bad drug phases, we targeted drug cartels and
Yeah.
then we targeted insurgents. Again, precision air power played an important role in Colombia, going after FARC leaders and stuff.
Yeah.
But that one of the reasons we won is because, it was kind of economy of force. It was enough to prevent the bad guys from ever winning. And then eventually we could build up the good guys enough to where they could prevail. Now
By
we'll
the
see
way,
if it lasts.
Yeah, go ahead.
you got to forgive me, but I've got to take the opportunity, Mike, given what you just said, to make an observation about some of the decisions that are being made today in terms of defense investment, and how oftentimes we go into what I call kind of bang bang guidance. Okay, and so we have what we've been calling for the last several years the pacing threat, right?
Aye.
China. And so you have everyone who is designing weapons strategy and tactics to be able to succeed in this highest
Right.
of high-end fights.
Right.
But
Right.
there's a tendency to ignore or at least put aside the realization that for 99.9% of the time, we're not involved in high-end fights. So
Right.
we're
No, right.
involved,
Exactly.
we're involved in these kinds of issues where maybe we don't need the highest capability platform. We need, more or more capable
It
remotely
almost, it
piloted
almost becomes
aircraft.
a self-fulfilling prophecy that because of what you're describing, Dave, we end up needing it down the line because we created conditions for it.
Well,
Yeah.
now
And
listen, I'm not saying that we shouldn't. We look.
I'm
Here's
with
the
you.
issue that the American people and sometimes folks in the Department of Defense don't realize. If in fact we want to execute, and by the way, I got to throw this out there. I'm so sick and tired of hearing frapping Congress people talk about, we spend more money than the next 20 nations combined.
Right.
Guess what, Mr. or Ms. Congressperson? The next 20 nations combined don't have the same national security strategy that we
Exactly.
do.
Exactly.
So if you want to engage around the world to shape and promote peace and stability, you need to be able to fight and succeed across the spectrum of conflict, from humanitarian assistance, disaster response, all the way up to global thermonuclear war. And you need to equip a military that's prepared to do so across that entire spectrum.
Here,
Okay,
here.
I'll
yeah,
stop
and
there.
I would just add, I agree with what Dave said.
Yeah.
I would just add that, we absolutely need a strategic deterrent force.
Yeah.
You don't want your whole military to be nuclear or something. It wouldn't be useful in a lot of,
Mhm.
and so it's the same thing with the little league rules. Every conflict is different. Our main goal is to deter conflict with China, but
Right.
if it happens, it will be likely a limited war. Why? Because same thing that governed the Cold War.
Yeah.
There's the escalation risk to nuclear weapons, but it's mostly an air, sea, space, and cyber theater. And waged with long range strike. Good luck to them if they try amphibious assault. And stuff. That's probably not going to turn out too well. And Russia, Ukraine is different from China, and you can bring different tools to
Yeah.
bear. And other conflicts, as Dave mentioned, are different still. And that's why you need a high-low mix of things, so you can have affordable mass. You need some exquisite things, nuclear submarines, B-21 bombers, etc. But you need a mix.
Credible and capable force array, key components of a deterrent strategy, is what I'm hearing both of you gentlemen saying. And to the general's point, Dave, to your point, we are not just another member, a nation state member of a community of nation states. We're also, it's like that old hair club for men commercial. I'm not just a member, I'm also its president, and I can say that because I've got nothing on no vegetation left.
There's
I'm still
always hope.
trying.
There's always hope.
There's always hope. There's always hope. I'm waiting for the technologists to come up with the magic elixir. Actually, if I could have articulated to my parents when they had me, I would have just said, "Hey, leave me like I came out, because this is really good for me." But anyway, we're also a global leading power. We're the super force, if not the superpower. We have additional obligations than just our national vital interests being taken care of. It's also a systems manager, which gets us back, at least in my mind, to trading away stalemate. That seems to be an interesting word in a context, in a concept, in a context that gets to, I call this in some of my other academic work, we fail to recognize and we find ourselves falling across this threshold that I call the Aurelius line, right? Marcus Aurelius, where you realize that you're at the frontiers, you've reached the frontiers. Now you got to work indirect methods as much or more than direct methods. You're working with client states in the old
Right.
ancient Roman context. And it's
Right.
more of a strategic defense,
Right.
really almost in a Clausewitzian way of the stronger form of war, a defensive shield capable of delivering multiple blows. And the multiple blows are multilateral. They're not just yours and what you can bring to bear. It's a collective effort, and who better to manage that part of the frontier than the indigenous client, the indigenous partner in those necks of the woods? That sounds very indirect method. It sounds like a perfect strategic management posture and profile for that indirect platforming of conventional and unconventional forces, ours and others, plus precision guided munitions in support of indigenous forces, modular and scalable. I mean, but it
Right.
seems we rush through that Aurelius line all the time. And maybe we bring this to the case in points of, the case in point of, what, we at CENTCOM during my tenure there called the enduring main effort of Iran and what's going on there. I would love to kind of transition us to maybe taking what we've talked about today so far and bringing it to the stage of the current conflict, war, et cetera, in and around Iran, and let you all just kind of, play with that for a bit. And then I'll go into, I've got a few lightning round questions I'd love to get your take on them. I draw those from the community of the Civic Brief and massage them a bit, and love to get your take on that. And I think we'll be there, and I'll keep to my contract with you all in terms of time. So whoever wants to start first, I'll let you guys
Dave,
grab.
you want to go?
Well, look, it's it's an extraordinarily complex situation, and quite frankly, what you see discussed is much of what we've already hit on here earlier, in that it's not just force application alone
Yeah.
that is going to result in the desired outcomes of what was initiated here with the military application of force. And now a lot of what we could discuss over another complete hour
Yeah.
is perhaps what could have been done to have gotten us to a point where we're better prepared. Again, I would suggest using taking a look at what was done in the prelude to Desert Storm. The securing of a coalition of partner nations, the approval of the Congress before engaging. But I don't want to go down there. I just mentioned those points in that it would have made things a lot easier. But we are where we are.
Yeah.
So the fact of the matter is, I believe that the president has made it quite clear what his priorities are in the context of Iran. You got to give up aspirations to build a nuclear weapon, and you've got to restore freedom of navigation through an international strait. That's kind of the bottom line. And now the issue is that Iran very much understands the pickle that the president's in with respect to public support. So it is a contest of, who is going to collapse first in terms of capitulating to the demands of the others.
Yeah.
Iran is under some significant pressure. Losing $500 million a day of revenue is not chump change. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with an autocratic regime like that, who really does not care about polls or their people, they can extend that, but they can only extend it so far. So, I don't have a solution here in being able to anticipate when this will come to conclusion, but I do believe Iran is coming to the realization that the president's not going to back off from those two goals. And so I think we'll see resolution here in the not too distant future. And clearly force is still on the table, but then we can get into a discussion of, what does that achieve relative to where we're already at in terms of limiting and putting economic pressure on Iran.
I just
Mike?
wonder, before I turn to Mike, I just wonder, Dave, why we deliberately avoided calling this a war at initiation. We called it everything else, but we called it even to include a special excursion, right? Military excursion. In what, to be fair, what unexpectedly, unintentionally derives from that of a greater expectation of what you can get achieved by use of force, but not use of force in the context of a full war, which would be multi-force, multi-compo, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's the
Yeah, I'm
Venezuela.
gonna let Mike. I actually can see the body. No, go ahead, Dave. But Mike's got body language saying nope.
Go ahead,
No,
Dave.
go ahead, Mike. I've
Yeah, I think
talked
it's the
enough already.
Venezuela disease, where you take a spectacular
Yeah,
tactical operation
yeah,
and think that achieves all your political, it's so easy and it achieves all
yeah.
your political objectives. Well, we'll see in Venezuela, how it turns out down the road.
Right,
Because that regime, you may have gotten Alibaba, but you didn't get the 40 thieves, and they're all still there.
right.
And and I think a similar big error in Iran was thinking that regime would just collapse with some
Correct.
application of military force.
Yeah,
And we've degraded them significantly. I mean, we've owned the sky and done lots of things to them, but the regime hasn't broken, and and their opposition gets slaughtered.
well, here's
So
a,
we could.
go ahead, please.
Yeah, so we could back, we've shown we can back a limited ground force to win. You can't, if you got nothing, it's a much tougher problem. And then I also think the strategic wisdom of doing it after we had arguably set back their nuclear program even more,
Hmm.
um, the previous June,
Yeah,
the biggest blow we could deal in the international system is to help the Ukrainians defeat the Russians. The Russians are a much bigger threat to
yes,
our interests. Iran's a threat. There's no question with proxies and other things. They've been beaten down pretty much. So
yeah,
why like Venezuela and Iran? Okay, even if you win, what have you done? You moved a pawn or two on the chessboard compared to, something bigger. I
right.
just, to me, one of the big lessons of strategy too from Afghanistan in the 80s is when your adversary makes a big mistake, take advantage of it.
Correct.
Take advantage of it.
Yes, yes.
And so like your comment about excursion or whatever the hell,
Yeah.
Putin still calls it a special military operation. It's the biggest war in Europe
Well,
since
that's the
World War
haunt.
II.
That's the haunt, right? As soon as that language was used of a little excursion, it immediately brought me back to
Yeah,
special military operation, right? And
yeah, it's not going so well. Yeah,
not going so well because you're not getting the framing right, right?
yeah,
Which is
right,
telltale from both protagonists' opening rounds.
right,
Right.
yeah,
The one
right,
other
right.
thing I want to say here, and I'm going to jump in the lightning round. I'm going to give you both last comments, and I'm going to get to the lightning round piece. To Dave, your earlier point about the WMD. I mean, I am perplexed also that, going before we launch a military combat operation, we had at least one problem, which was Iranian WMD. We come out of it owning two at least, which is two WMD problems or WME, weapons of mass effect problems, because I unfortunately think, we ended up helping Iran realize that geography still matters. And
Right.
they've got an enormous strategic, tactical to strategic, grand strategic advantage of interior lines with being geographically placed where they are to hold the hose. That game we played, we were 5-year-olds on the lawn, crimping the hose and winning the water wars, right? Or in this case, the petroleum and everything that comes from petroleum products wars. And now, now toll boothing it. I'm,
And here's an example.
yeah,
It's not
please.
just mines. It's not just clearing the Straits of Mines. It's primitive forms of air power,
Yeah,
drones and some missiles that
yeah,
hold those ships at risk.
yes.
And so it shows you what you can do.
I'm curious as to what lessons gatherable for learning. Kind of, Dave, to yours in Frankie's recent piece, your recent article, as it might apply in terms of geographic choke points, geography getting a heavier vote in some of these areas with the missile conversation that you and Frankie had recently. That's got rightly and deservedly gotten a lot of important commentary on. Maybe give you a chance to speak to that a bit.
Yeah, no, yeah, thanks for the opportunity. The major, there's a lot in that
Yeah,
particular article, but the biggest point I wanted to get across was the fact that if you want to deter China, you have to stop talking about ceding sanctuary to them in any kind of a conflict,
yeah,
because that's the way we've been talking for 20 frapping years. And that's not going to deter China. What's going to deter China is to understand that their homeland is at risk from in a conventional perspective. And this whole notion that, oh my God, China has all these missiles, and oh my gosh, we can't populate the first island chain or even the second island chain, and we're going to have to go back to Chicago and operate from there is nonsense. We've always had adversaries who can pose us a significant threat.
yeah,
But what do? We put together a campaign that takes away their ability to do that. That's called offensive counter-air
there you
operations.
go.
All right. And
Yep,
so, and by the way, this isn't about, fighter jet versus fighter jet, shooting down the fighter jet in the sky. We didn't do that against Baghdad. What we did was we negated their entire
yeah,
ability to use their air defenses
yeah,
by taking out all that capability and command and control on the ground. And,
yeah,
and so we need to put in place the same set of concepts and apply them to China. And by the way, cyber is going to play a huge part in all of this. Anyway, that was the essence of this is stop playing defense only.
yeah,
All right. And there's a whole crowd in the Pentagon that's
Yeah.
ready to throw up their arms and say, we can't do this.
Yeah.
And the point is, yes, we can.
yeah.
And in order to deter conflict in the first place, they need to understand that that's what we're going to do.
And
Now,
that last point you
I-
just made, in order to deter conflict
Yes.
as the political object, key
When
and critical.
when I was an assistant secretary, I had an expanded job. It would used to be Solic, and they gave
Oh,
me
yeah.
oversight of the defense planning guidance and force transformation, other stuff. So I used advantage to advocate for things like the B-21 and a bigger submarine force and others. And
Right.
I remember people saying, "We'll never strike the Chinese mainland. Why are we doing this?" And I said, "Look, I don't know what future presidents are going to do, but I want them to have more options rather than future options.
Yeah.
And I want the Chinese to worry about it,
Yeah.
because it'll strengthen deterrence.
Right.
And, who knows what they'll do? I hope they do what Dave said, which is not
Yeah.
to just cede sanctuary, but ceding it from the beginning and saying, well, we're not going to do that is crazy.
Right. Couple of lightning round questions that come from the audience, real quick. And the shorter, this is coming from me, the guy who's cursed with the gift of gab. But I'm going to ask you to, the shorter the answer, the better. Even if you can get down to a couple of words. One historical case we most misunderstand and why. You'll need more than one word answer for that. One historical case we most misunderstand and why.
Okay, I'm going to tell you what I told you earlier, Desert Storm, because
Yeah.
we remember it as a combined air-ground victory, which it was, but people often understate the operational reality, and that's that air operations dismantled Iraqi's warfighting system for 38 days before the ground operations began.
Correct.
So
Wow.
in Desert Storm, the classic roles of air power and land power changed places, and it was the first conflict where air forces were the key force and ground forces operated in support. That doesn't mean one's better than the other. It just reflects the reality of what was appropriate at the time.
Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, and I would say among a lot of the community, there's a big misunderstanding of Afghanistan since 9/11.
Yeah.
That, we were destined to fail there. That isn't true. I mean, we failed at the end because of the decisions by two presidents, to just leave and trade stalemate for defeat and surrender. And it's not that we didn't make lots of mistakes, but it's not that, the Taliban were 10 feet tall and they were going to
Right.
defeat us. We ceded it to them.
Well,
They
it's
never could have won. They never could have won had we even stayed minimally.
is that a variation of the end of the Charlie Wilson's descriptive of effing up the end
No, I
game?
mean that one, yeah, I think there it's more complicated in a sense of understanding um, based on what you know after 9/11, do
Yeah.
you think we behaved appropriately in the 90s? As we saw
Right,
this
right, right.
threat gathering,
Yeah.
did we not take it? Because our mindset of terrorism up to that point was somebody hijacks an airliner, maybe blows up an embassy, but it's not a war. It's,
Right.
and where with Al Qaeda, it was a war. You
Yes.
know,
Yeah. Um, One domain of warfare we currently overestimate, as well as,
That's easy.
yep.
That's an easy one. Land power, when it's treated as the automatic answer to every military problem.
Oh, excellent.
Look, land forces are indispensable in some contingencies, but they're not inherently decisive.
Yeah.
And they can be counterproductive when the objective does not require occupation.
Does any instrument bring a decisive battle?
No, which goes back to my original premise is
Yeah.
no serious strategist
There you go.
believes war is waged in any domain alone, not on land, not at sea, not in the air, not in space, not in cyberspace.
Yeah.
Modern military campaigns succeed by integrating capabilities across domains in pursuit of defined political objectives.
Oh my gosh. Well said. Well said. Mike, your thought. Most
yeah, I would
currently
say it's
overestimate?
I would say it's more within domains where we tend to have legacy positions of overestimating the value of certain forces because we
great
don't
point.
want to give them up.
Yeah.
And, so for instance, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but naval air power has two missions: one to help control the sea, and the other is to project power on land.
Yeah.
Missiles have largely taken over that, and the amount of air power you can generate from aircraft carriers is limited to what we can do, what we've been able to do for decades now with land-based air power, just because of the reach of it and the mass of it and others. And so it's not that it's not useful in certain circumstances. It really is not as powerful an instrument of air power.
Hey, Mike,
If and when we launch unmanned and drones from those
Well, we're not right. I mean, the trouble is we're not.
I'm just
sticking
wondering
to-
what that looks like going forward.
Yeah, that would be better
here.
because
I got to ask that question. I got the experts here on both.
it would allow carriers to stand off further out of missile
Yeah.
range if they had longer range aircraft. But also, you're looking what drones are doing in Ukraine from the front lines to strategic attack. And how cheaply, and even using some for air defense. It's pretty remarkable. It's even putting military snipers out of business, not
Right.
just
Right.
So it's pretty impressive.
I want to.
And then cyber, I
please.
would say, it's a dynamic field, but sometimes there's overestimates of what it can do. Can you really count on it when you need it? Like I could count on a kinetic action if I'm a planner. But that could change, and part of it depends on how you use it. So most of our adversaries go for counter value cyber. They attack electrical power grids or plan for that. We do really counter force. We want to take out their defended systems, and that's a harder target.
I'm going to ask you both the same, one last question, and then I'll let you get an opportunity to, what you want the audience here to, what you want to leave them with. But here's the penultimate. One thing young officers must understand about war today.
Okay, I'll jump in here. I alluded to it earlier, and that's the correct understanding of jointness.
Yeah.
And, I made the point that I don't believe our professional military education institutions are teaching it. And as a result, there's a persistent misunderstanding of jointness. Look, separate services are not an obstacle to jointness. They're a prerequisite for it.
Oh,
it takes decades to cultivate the judgment required to command a division on land, a battle group at sea, or a joint force air or space component.
Yeah.
These are not interchangeable acts or arts. The duty of a joint force commander is not to blur them together, but to exploit them in combination using the right force at the right place at the right time.
Golly, that's great.
And that's my closing statement too.
I mean, again, that doesn't get better than that. I'm going to poster that. I'm going to make that into a poster, Dave. General, thank you. Mike, over to you.
So I would say the character or conduct of war is changing, and professionals need to pay attention to that. The rise of unmanned systems, the increased importance of space, and maybe cyber, and particularly AI-enabled cyber and quantum-enabled cyber.
Yeah.
But the nature of war isn't changing. It's still about connecting military means to political ends, and we screw that up a lot. And so,
grammar, Clausewitz haunts, right? Again, the grammar changes. Be aware and be anticipatory of the change of the grammar. The logic endures.
Right.
Gentlemen, with that, thank you again. Thank you for this, but broadly, I just want to take an opportunity. I love the fact that I've been able to have you both here, and particularly together. It's honorific, an honor for me, as a soldier once and young, and you all are icons then and now. And one of the reasons why I want to bring you in, we've, I think, done a good job from a civic engagement in terms of helping the readership remember or learn for the first time at least a couple, if not more, of the major recent historical mile markers that give us those source pools of lessons to gather for our learning and application, most similar, not same similar application to our contemporary puzzles and the ones that are around the corner, right in front of us. I want to thank you for the service today. I want to thank you broadly for your lifetimes of services that continue. And Dave, I'm gonna you earlier. I wrote it down. I'm not gonna hold it to it, but you said if we had another hour, we'd love to. We should talk about this. There were at least a couple of things I'd love to bring you all back on another episode.
We got to talk about Ukraine.
We got it. So I want to bring you back on. If I can almost get a date with you both now to figure out the right time to talk Ukraine, and I want to talk about this regime stuff. Right.
But Mike hit the nail on the head. Putin is a declared enemy of the United States of America, and we need to take advantage of what's going on. My God, why we haven't assisted Ukraine in accomplishing its objectives, because guess what? It's fighting for all the principles that those of us in the United States 250 years ago stood up and fought to achieve. Why in God's name would we not be supporting a nation state that's committed to doing that?
And St. Augustine would recognize this as a just war if there ever was one. So,
well, both of your points, amen to that, to both, but particularly haunting from a just war theory to practice standpoint, in this happening in our 250th birthday.
Yes.
Okay, we will.
And it's a war, Ike, not a conflict.
And it's a war. Correct. It's a war. Epilogue is prologue, gentlemen. Thank you. I'll be in touch shortly.
Good to be with you both.
Next round. Thanks so much. Thanks for your service.
Hey, thanks, Ike. Thanks for doing this. And Mike, it's great to see you again. And
likewise.
I'm voting for Mike Vickers for sec war / defense next time around.
100%. I'm there with you.
All right. Take care, guys.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning into the Civic Brief. Got questions, insights, or ideas? Join us at thecivicbrief.com to continue the dialogue. Subscribe, share, and be part of shaping the future, one brief at a time.
War is not a problem of force, it's a problem of order, and force is only one part of that equation. So as we close, one idea stands out. For generations, we searched for a decisive instrument of war, but history suggests something more sobering and more important. Military power, uses and utilities of the instrument of military force. It can disrupt. It can dislocate. It can even help bring down regimes. But it does not, by itself, determine what comes next. And what comes next? Well, it's the actual war. War is not won by instruments of power. It is won or lost by political outcomes. Understanding that distinction may be one of the most important civic responsibilities we have. Dr. Vickers, General Deptula, thank you both for your service, your leadership, and for joining us in this conversation. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. Until next time, I'm still Dr. Ike Wilson. This is the Civic Brief for Nation Not Self. Cheers.